6 fighters, $42 million each, cratered on the apron before a single pilot reached the cockpit. That is what happens when Ukrainian SIGINT operators find a 14-minute gap in an S-400 radar handover cycle and have the nerve to thread a Storm Shadow salvo through it. This is the story of a strike that didn't just destroy aircraft. It took apart the interceptor screen protecting Russia's last operational submarine ramp on the Black Sea, a screen that Russian Pacific Fleet commanders had spent months rebuilding after losing Belbek, a screen they were convinced nothing could touch. They were wrong. The men who proved them wrong flew a Soviet-era Su-24M at treetop altitude over a Ukrainian summer night, guiding 2 British-built Storm Shadow cruise missiles toward a target that Russian radar operators weren't watching, because Russian radar operators had a schedule, and Ukrainian intelligence had read it. I'm your host at Ukraine Radar, where we break down the battles that change wars. Today, we're covering one of the most technically precise deep strike operations of the entire conflict. A mission that combined British missile engineering, Ukrainian SIGINT work, and the nerve of a 2-man crew flying a 40-year-old jet into the most heavily defended airspace on the Black Sea coast. Stay with me. The details are more extraordinary than the headline. To understand why Saki mattered, why this airbase on the western tip of Crimea became the top air defense suppression target in the Ukrainian Air Force's deck, you need to understand what had been happening at Belbek. Belbek is Crimea's other major aviation base. Located on the northern outskirts of Sevastopol, it had historically been Russia's primary hub for Su-27 and Su-30SM interceptors protecting the Black Sea Fleet's naval aviation umbrella. For much of the full-scale phase, Belbek's Su-30SM squadrons were the main threat to Ukrainian air operations over the Western theater. Their long-range R-77 active radar homing missiles gave Russian pilots a beyond visual range engagement envelope that Ukrainian aircraft had to respect. Then Ukrainian F-16S arrived. The integration of Western fourth-generation fighters into the Ukrainian Air Force changed the arithmetic of aerial combat over the Black Sea. Ukrainian pilots trained in Poland and Romania returned with aircraft carrying AIM-120 AMRAAM missiles, the same class of weapon that defined Western air dominance doctrine for 3 decades. Suddenly, Russian Su-30SM pilots flying out of Belbek found themselves in beyond visual range engagements against opponents who were no longer technically inferior. The first BVR engagement to go badly for Russia occurred somewhere over the western Black Sea. Exact coordinates remain classified, but the outcome was documented by both Ukrainian General Staff reports and independent OSINT flight track analysis. A Russian Su-30SM, likely attempting to shadow a Ukrainian reconnaissance drone, engaged and was itself engaged. The pilot ejected. The aircraft did not return to Belbek. That single event had consequences far beyond one lost airframe. Russian Southern Military District Air Command immediately suspended offensive patrol operations from Belbek. The base wasn't abandoned. Ground crews, maintenance personnel, and administrative staff remained, but the Su-30SM squadrons were pulled back, rotated to Saki. Saki, on Crimea's western coast near Novofedorivka, offered greater depth from the engagement envelope of Ukrainian F-16S operating from central Ukrainian air bases. The extra distance provided, by Russian calculation, a meaningful tactical buffer. What Russian planners hadn't accounted for was that moving their interceptors to Saki didn't make those interceptors invisible. It made them a concentrated, high-value target, and put them in range of a weapon that doesn't need a radar lock to find its objective: Storm Shadow. Which weapon was deadlier in this theater? A. HIMARS B, Storm Shadow C, naval drone? Comment below, because the answer might surprise you by the end of this analysis. The Storm Shadow cruise missile, designated SCALP-EG in French service, is a precision terrain-following weapon developed jointly by MBDA and BAE Systems. It entered service with the Royal Air Force in 2003 and has been combat-proven over Libya, Syria, and Iraq. Ukraine received Storm Shadows through a British government transfer decision that fundamentally changed the long-range precision strike balance in the conflict. The missile's published specifications tell only part of the story. Storm Shadow carries a Bro-H warhead, a 2-stage penetrating munition. The first stage blasts through hardened cover. The second stage detonates inside the structure after penetrating the outer shell. Against aircraft parked on an open apron, Bro-H's penetrating capability is almost secondary. The fragmentation and blast over pressure from a missile of this class is enough to catastrophically destroy an Su-30SM at close range and damage aircraft further away through secondary fragmentation. Range exceeds 500 kilometers under operational conditions, though actual launch parameters depend heavily on the carrier aircraft's altitude and speed at release. Guidance uses terrain reference navigation, GPS, and an infrared imaging seeker for terminal guidance. The the DS-MAX system, which matches a stored image of the target against live sensor feed in the final seconds of approach. That terminal guidance is central to how Ukrainian planners approach the Saki strike. The DS-MAX seeker needs a clean image match. Target coordinates must be precise. Aircraft parking positions must be verified. And the missile's approach path must account for obstacles. Hangars, fuel storage, support structures. That might obscure the target signature or cause the seeker to acquire the wrong aim point. Ukrainian intelligence had spent considerable time building that targeting package. Stay with me. What the SIGINT battalions discovered about Saki's S-400 radar handover schedule is the detail that makes this entire operation possible. Saky is not a simple airbase. It was originally a Soviet-era naval aviation facility. Its runway, taxiways, and hardened aircraft shelters were built to Cold War specifications. The base carries a substantial integrated air defense layer. S-400 Triumph batteries, shorter-range Panzer S-1 systems for point defense, and radar coverage that, under normal conditions, represents a serious challenge for a subsonic cruise missile approaching at low altitude. Under normal conditions. Ukrainian SIGINT battalions had been monitoring Saki's electronic emissions for months. The 72nd Main Intelligence Center and affiliated intercept units had built a detailed picture of the base's radar operating patterns, not just frequencies and waveforms, but the operational schedule, the handover cycles between radar systems, the gaps. Every air defense network has gaps. The question is whether those gaps are exploitable and whether an adversary can find them. At Saki, Ukrainian SIGINT identified a recurring vulnerability in the S-400 battery's radar handover cycle. The primary engagement radar, the 92N6 Gravestone, requires periodic maintenance cycles that temporarily reduce its coverage sector. When the Gravestone enters maintenance mode, coverage should transfer to a secondary radar system. At Saki, that transfer was not instantaneous. There was a window, 14 minutes, based on Ukrainian intercept analysis of the electronic signature patterns observed across multiple operating cycles. 14 minutes. At Storm Shadow's subsonic cruise speed of approximately 1,000 kilometers per hour, 14 minutes is roughly 233 kilometers of missile flight time. More than enough, given the launch parameters Ukrainian Air Force planners had identified, to cross from the missile's optimal approach corridor across the Crimean steppe to the Saki apron. But exploiting this window required knowing exactly when it would open. And here's where the obstacle that nearly derailed the mission came into play. 3 weeks before the strike, Ukrainian SIGINT analysts detected a change in Saki's radar emission patterns. The Russian technical team at the base had apparently received an upgrade or recalibration, possibly in response to intelligence suggesting that Ukrainian electronic collection was mapping their radar cycles. The Gravestone's maintenance schedule became irregular. The 14-minute window was still there, but its timing was no longer predictable from pattern analysis alone. Ukrainian planners faced a choice: abort the mission and wait for new pattern data, potentially weeks of additional observation, or find another way to trigger the window on demand. They found another way. Ukrainian electronic warfare specialists, coordinating with the SIGINT battalion, developed a tailored jamming protocol, a burst transmission on frequencies known to affect the Gravestone's secondary communication architecture. Not enough to blind the radar outright, which would trigger an immediate alert, but enough to push it into self-diagnostic mode. Self-diagnostic mode initiated the exact maintenance handover sequence Ukrainian analysts had mapped. They could ring the doorbell, open the window, time the strike accordingly. That coordination between SIGINT collection, electronic warfare, and strike planning is the kind of multi-domain integration that Western military doctrine has been theorizing about for decades. Ukraine was doing it operationally. The targeting package was complete. The window mechanism was tested. The Su-24M crew was briefed. Then, 48 hours before the planned launch window, Ukrainian Air Force Command received satellite imagery showing a development at Saki that changed the mission's priority calculation entirely. The imagery confirmed what HUMINT sources had been suggesting for days. Russia was rotating additional Su-30SM airframes into Saki, not just the 2 squadrons already there. A third unit was being positioned. The apron concentration was higher than at any point in the previous operating period. 6 Su-30SM fighters, possibly more, on the apron, at rest. Fueled and armed for the morning's planned defensive patrol cycle, the strike window was not just viable. it was now potentially decisive. The Su-24M fencer that would carry the Storm Shadows that night deserves more respect than Western analysts typically give it. Built in the 1970s as a Soviet low-level supersonic strike aircraft, the Su-24M was designed to penetrate NATO air defenses at high speed and extremely low altitude. Its variable sweep wing allows it to optimize aerodynamics across its speed envelope. Its terrain-following radar enables nap-of-the-earth flight, hugging the ground at altitudes that defeat conventional early warning radar. Ukrainian Su-24M crews have been using this terrain-following capability throughout the conflict, flying at extremely low altitudes, often below 100 meters above ground level. They stay masked by terrain features, structures, and the radar horizon limitations of ground-based air defense systems. At these altitudes, the aircraft's radar cross-section is effectively invisible to long-range search radars looking outward from the target area. The crew assigned to this mission had logged considerable combat hours on the Su-24M. The pilot, operating under the call sign that Ukrainian Air Force protocol typically renders as a two-character identifier, had previously flown Storm Shadow delivery missions over the Kerch Bridge area and against Russian logistics nodes near Jankoy. The weapons systems officer in the rear seat handled the Storm Shadow pre-launch sequencing, a technically demanding process requiring precise target coordinates, approach path parameters, and terminal guidance imagery loaded into the missile's mission data computer. On the night of the mission, the Su-24M lifted off from a dispersed forward operating location in Mykolaiv Oblast, not a major base. Dispersal is a survival doctrine for Ukrainian combat aircraft in the current threat environment. The aircraft had been moved to this location specifically for this mission, its Storm Shadow loadout attached and checked, fuel tanks topped for the flight profile. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar if you want to understand how modern warfare actually works, because what this crew did next shows a level of tactical precision that most military analysts in Western capitals still underestimate. The flight plan took the Su-24M south and west, following the Ukrainian coastline before transitioning to its final ingress profile. At altitudes between 50 and 80 meters above terrain, the aircraft's radar signature was swallowed by ground clutter. Russian radar operators at Saki and across the Crimean integrated air defense network were looking outward, their search sectors oriented to detect threats from Ukrainian-controlled territory to the north and northeast. The Su-24M came from a different direction. Timing was everything. The crew had a defined launch window correlated to the electronic warfare jamming sequence. Too early, and the Gravestone radar would still be in full operating mode. Too late, and the window would start closing before the Storm Shadows reached their terminal approach point. At the precise moment, the Ukrainian EW specialist transmitted the tailored jamming burst, sending the Gravestone into its self-diagnostic cycle. The Su-24M crew began the Storm Shadow pre-launch checklist. How many Su-30SM fighters did the strike destroy? A 2B4C6? The answer is coming. Stay with me. The Storm Shadow's launch sequence from Su-24M is not a simple trigger pull. The weapons systems officer runs through a multi-step process. Final verification of the target data package, confirmation of the missile's navigation system, initialization, and a pre-release self-test verifying the seeker is receiving valid data. Under combat conditions, with electronic warfare emissions in the environment and the aircraft in terrain-following mode at low altitude, this demands complete focus. The weapons systems officer had that focus. 2 missiles. Sequential release interval of approximately 4 seconds. The first Storm Shadow dropped from the Su-24M's pylon and its turbojet engine ignited, accelerating to cruise speed as it leveled on its programmed approach vector. Terrain-following programming kept it low, below 30 meters in the final approach corridor, threading between Crimean topographic features that would defeat any radar trying to track it at low grazing angles. The second missile followed 4 seconds later on a slightly divergent approach track, a deliberate planning choice. 2 missiles arriving from slightly different vectors complicated any point defense response. The Panzer S-1 systems protecting Saki's apron were optimized for threats arriving in predictable corridors. 2 missiles on divergent final tracks stress the engagement geometry of a system that, while capable, has known limitations against multiple simultaneous low-altitude targets. Meanwhile, the Su-24M crew had already begun egress. Low altitude, high speed, back toward Ukrainian airspace. The mission was not over until wheels touched down, but the weapons were away and performing nominally. The Gravestone radar came back online approximately 11 minutes after the EW jamming burst. By that point, the Storm Shadows were already deep into Crimean airspace, past any realistic intercept opportunity. The first Storm Shadow impacted the Saki apron between the 3rd and 4th aircraft in the line. The Bro-H warhead fired as designed, the precursor charge blasting through the thin aluminum tarmac before the main warhead detonated below surface level. the blast over pressure wave expanded outward across the apron. At the distances involved, Su-30SM fighters parked in standard ground crew spacing. The effects were catastrophic. The aircraft immediately adjacent to the impact point, one on each side, absorbed direct blast over pressure and primary fragmentation. At under 10 meters from the detonation point, structural failure of the airframe is essentially guaranteed. Canopy destruction, fuel tank rupture, avionics obliterated. Aircraft beyond that radius, at 15 to 25 meters, received secondary fragmentation. High-velocity metal fragments from the first aircraft's destruction becoming a secondary munition wave radiating outward. The second storm shadow arrived 7 seconds later. Different aim point, targeting the far end of the parked line, where the satellite imagery had shown the most recently arrived airframes. A second Bro-H detonation. A second overpressure wave. Satellite imagery analysis in the hours following the strike confirmed what ground observers and intercepted communications had already indicated. 6 Su-30SM fighters destroyed or rendered non-repairable, confirmed by combat footage verification and OSINT investigation of post-strike imagery. 2 ground support vehicles, a fuel bowser and a maintenance platform, were destroyed in secondary fires from leaking aviation fuel. A taxiway section adjacent to the apron was cratered, temporarily blocking aircraft movement on that hard standing. The Saki apron was no longer a functioning interceptor platform. If you believe tactics win wars, and this mission proves they do, type Ukraine radar in the comments. Because what happened next shows why this strike was far more than a property damage count. The real consequence of destroying 6 Su-30SM interceptors at Saki was not simply losing 6 aircraft from Russia's Black Sea air defense inventory. It was the collapse of the interceptor screen protecting the Sevastopol submarine pen ramp, the Black Sea Fleet's remaining submarine assets. Kilo-class diesel-electric submarines operate from the Sevastopol naval base complex. The submarine ramp facility in the southern harbor has been a persistent Ukrainian strike target throughout the conflict, with multiple attempts using Neptune anti-ship missiles, naval drone swarms, and Storm Shadow strikes targeting dock infrastructure. Russia's response had been to maintain a standing combat air patrol over the southern Crimea coast using Saki-based Su-30SM fighters. Those interceptors weren't primarily tasked with air-to-air engagements. They were scanning, communicating threat vectors to Panzer batteries along the coast, and providing early warning of inbound low-altitude threats that ground-based radar might miss in the coastal terrain. With the Saki interceptors gone, that coverage layer degraded, not eliminated. Russia could and would rotate replacement aircraft from mainland bases, but the immediate gap was real. Ukrainian Air Force intelligence assessed the replacement timeline in days, not hours. That was a window. A different kind of window. But there was a complication. The Saki strike generated an immediate Russian response. Within hours of post-strike imagery appearing on OSINT channels, Russian Southern Military District Command initiated an enhanced air patrol regime over all of Crimea. Additional S-400 batteries went to heightened readiness. The radar emission signatures that Ukrainian SIGINT had painstakingly mapped. The patterns, schedules, and handover cycles were immediately invalidated as Russian technical crews shifted to non-standard operating procedures. Every intelligence advantage built over months of collection was zeroed out in a single stroke. Ukrainian Air Force Command made a decision that reflects the operational maturity the force has developed across years of high-intensity combat. Don't push through the heightened Russian alert status. That was how aircraft got lost. Let the alert cycle degrade naturally. Russian crews couldn't sustain maximum readiness indefinitely. Physical fatigue, equipment maintenance cycles, command frustration at the absence of a follow-on strike. All of these factors would gradually erode the enhanced posture. Wait. Watch. Rebuild the targeting picture. The intercepted communications from Saki in the immediate aftermath told their own story. Ukrainian SIGINT units monitoring Russian military frequencies documented what can only be described as command-level panic. Initial transmissions were fragmented. Ground crew reports of explosions, fire on the apron, requests for emergency services, standard emergency traffic. But within 30 minutes, the pattern shifted. Higher echelon traffic. Encrypted channels accessed at unusual frequencies. Transmission patterns consistent with Southern Military District Command requesting direct contact with 4th Air and Air Defense Army headquarters. What would NATO have done differently in this situation? Comment your analysis, because the doctrinal implications of this strike are exactly what Western defense planning needs to study. Ukrainian intelligence analysts processing the intercepted communications noted a recurring theme across multiple transmissions. The Russian base commander was not primarily focused on casualties. There were none, since the strike had been precisely timed for hours when ground crews were off the apron. He was focused on explaining to his superiors how 6 aircraft had been destroyed without warning. without warning. Because from the perspective of every Russian radar system at and around Saki, there had been no warning. The storm shadows arrived below the detection threshold. The EW jamming was precise enough to open the window without triggering alert protocols. The approach vectors threaded the gaps in coverage. From inside the Russian air defense net, the strike came from nowhere. That was not an accident. It was the product of months of Ukrainian intelligence work, engineering analysis, and mission planning. Applied by a two-person crew flying a 4-decade-old aircraft that had been adapted, upgraded, and operated with a level of skill that would have impressed the Soviet engineers who designed it. The battle damage assessment, compiled from satellite imagery and OSINT investigation, documented the full scale of what had been achieved. 6 Su-30SM fighters destroyed. At the export list, price of approximately $42 million per airframe, that is over $250 million in aviation assets eliminated by 2 missiles with a combined procurement cost of approximately $4 million, a cost-exchange ratio of more than 60-1. That number deserves a moment. 60-1. 2 Storm Shadow missiles, operated by a 2-person crew on a mission lasting approximately 90 minutes from takeoff to landing, destroyed $250 million in Russian military aviation. No delivery aircraft lost. No Ukrainian casualties. No alert until impact. Drone operators and F-16 pilots get most of the public attention and coverage of Ukrainian air operations. Rightly so. Their contributions are extraordinary. But the Su-24M crews delivering storm shadows with this level of precision across multiple strike missions represent a category of operational capability that is easy to understate. These are pilots and weapons officers flying an elderly airframe, modified for a role it was never designed to perform, into some of the most heavily defended airspace in the world, at night, at low altitude, with no margin for navigation error or timing deviation. By any reasonable professional military standard, they are exceptional. The broader implication of the Saki strike extended beyond the immediate tactical balance. Russian Black Sea Fleet staff, according to Ukrainian intelligence assessment, initiated an immediate review of all interceptor staging locations across Crimea following the strike. The concentration model, multiple high-value aircraft at a single base for maximum operational flexibility, was reconsidered. Dispersal options were evaluated. Dispersal is the tactically correct response to the threat Storm Shadow represents. But it comes at a cost. Dispersed aircraft require dispersed ground crews, dispersed maintenance facilities, dispersed fuel and weapons logistics. Dispersal reduces operational readiness. Aircraft distributed across multiple small facilities can't be surged for mass operations with the same efficiency as concentrated forces. In forcing Russia to reconsider its interceptor concentration at Saki, Ukrainian planners imposed a structural cost on Russian air operations that extended well beyond the 6 aircraft destroyed. Every operational decision Russian Air Command makes about Crimean basing going forward is now made with the knowledge that Ukrainian SIGINT can find the gaps and Ukrainian Storm Shadow crews will use them. Will Ukraine execute another major deep strike package against Crimean air defenses in the next operational cycle? Comment yes or no, because the targeting pattern suggests this campaign has more chapters. The lessons of this strike are clear. First, integrated air defense systems are only as strong as their weakest operational seam. The S-400 is an extraordinarily capable system against the threat sets it was designed to defeat. Against a coordinated attack that exploits its maintenance cycle through tailored electronic warfare, timed with precision cruise missiles approaching below the radar horizon, its effectiveness is drastically reduced. No air defense system is a complete solution. Every system has seams. Second, electronic warfare and kinetic strike are not separate capabilities. They multiply each other. The Saki mission worked because Ukrainian EW specialists could trigger the radar window on demand. Without that trigger, the 14-minute gap remained theoretically exploitable but practically inaccessible. The integration of EW and strike, not just coordination, but operational fusion, is the lesson any serious military should take from this mission. Third, the value of long-term SIGINT investment is hard to overstate. The months of collection that built the picture of Saki's radar operating patterns were not glamorous work. They were not combat operations. They were patient, technically demanding, analytically intensive signals collection. The return on that investment was a 2-minute apron strike that eliminated 6 interceptors and degraded Crimea's air defense architecture. Fourth, platform age matters less than crew competence and weapon quality. The Su-24M is older than most of the Ukrainian officers flying it. It is a product of Soviet aerospace engineering from an era when the Berlin Wall still stood. And it delivered 2 Storm Shadow missiles with enough precision to exploit a 14-minute radar gap and destroy 6 aircraft on an apron defended by multiple layers of Russian air defense. The aircraft mattered less than the people flying it and the weapon it carried. And fifth, perhaps most important for the long-term trajectory of this conflict, Ukraine does not simply use the weapons its allies provide. Ukraine innovates with them. The EW trigger mechanism that made this strike possible was not a British or American capability transfer. It was a Ukrainian solution to a Ukrainian targeting problem. The integration of electronic warfare jamming with Storm Shadow delivery timing was a Ukrainian doctrinal development. That capacity for operational innovation, finding new applications for existing capabilities, is what makes Ukrainian military power harder to forecast, harder to counter, and harder to degrade than any equipment inventory would suggest. Real tactics. Real consequences. Ukraine radar. Now, the answer to the question posed earlier in this analysis. How many Su-30SM fighters did the Saki strike destroy? The answer is C6 aircraft confirmed destroyed or rendered non-repairable, documented by post-strike satellite imagery analysis and OSINT verification. Not 2, not 4. 6 Su-30SM interceptors. The entire standing Saki-based interceptor screen, eliminated in a single 2-missile salvo by a single Su-24M crew. The figure of 6 matters beyond its arithmetic value. 6 aircraft is a full squadron equivalent of Russian naval aviation interceptors. In the context of a Black Sea fleet that has been systematically reduced through Ukrainian strikes across multiple domains, naval drone attacks on surface combatants, Neptune anti-ship missile strikes on capital ships, Storm Shadow attacks on port facilities and maintenance infrastructure. The loss of 6 interceptors at a single base represents a qualitative degradation that rapid replacement cannot easily fix. Su-30SM airframes are not produced in unlimited quantities. Trained naval aviation crews are not interchangeable with ground forces. Each loss compounds. 3 questions to close. Was the decision to exploit the EW-triggered radar window the right tactical choice? Or should Ukrainian planners have waited for a naturally occurring gap to reduce the risk of Russian technical countermeasures adapting to the triggering technique? Could Russian air defense have prevented this strike? And if so, what operational changes would have been required? And what would you have done differently if you were the Ukrainian Air Force commander responsible for the targeting decision that sent that Su-24M crew across the Black Sea coast? Think through those questions. The answers are not obvious. Working through them carefully is how you build the analytical framework to understand the next operation before it becomes history. Subscribe to Ukraine Radar, because we break down the battles that textbooks will study for decades. Saki is quiet now. The apron where 6 Su-30SM fighters once waited for the morning patrol has been cleared of debris. The craters have been partially filled. Russian engineering crews have worked to erase the visual evidence of what happened there, but the aircraft are not coming back. The crew that flew the mission landed safely. And somewhere in Ukraine, the SIGINT analysts who found the 14-minute window are already watching the next target. Modern warfare punishes tactical mistakes without mercy. Stay vigilant.